Dr. Missy Henke from the great state of North Dakota. And I'm just glad that she agreed to educate us all on this critically important subject. And the reason, this was important 3 years ago when we initially covered this, but now more than ever, people are overdosing at record levels. People need to know, families need to know what's going on so that they can make an educated decision. And the stigma that Tom, who shared his story, I had somebody reach out to me who saw the subject, read the flyer, and he got in touch with me and he sent me a text saying that reading the flyer kind of prompted me to think that I should be more outspoken in sharing my story. He is a medically assisted, treated person in recovery. And he said, I haven't been doing it. And I know the reason why he wasn't doing it. It's because of the stigma associated with it. And that's not to say that abstinence is a bad thing. It's a good thing. And I think what we're going to learn today from Dr. Henke is that there is no silver bullet. There is no one size fits all. And this is why at Washtenaw Fan, and I've used this analogy over and over again, that we want to fill that recovery quiver with as many arrows as possible. Yoga, exercise, bus passes, MAT, abstinence, trauma-informed yoga. We even just had an offer from the University of Michigan School of Social Work to start holding grief group therapy sessions, and we're going to take them up on that. Why? I got a fly zapping around me, guys, sorry, or a mosquito. Why? Because it's needed in our community for those who don't make it. So with that, I wanted to turn it over to our guest speaker, Dr. Melissa Henke from North Dakota. And Dr. Henke, why don't you start by just talking with everyone, sharing your story and how you came to become triple certified in one of them is addiction. You're an addiction psychiatrist, right? And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Henke.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate any opportunity that I can get to speak about this topic. It has become a passion of mine. But the other day in visiting with Mario, we were talking about how I ended up doing this. And I did my formal training, my residency training was in internal medicine and psychiatry. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew that I didn't want to work with kids and I knew that I didn't want to work with addiction. And when I moved back to North Dakota, I ran into a friend of mine who had been my faculty when I was a student. And while I was gone, she had married the executive director of the Heartview Foundation. The Heartview Foundation is a local drug and alcohol treatment center in the heart of North Dakota that's been around since 1964. It is the foundations of the 12 steps is how this place was built. And I ran into them at Target, and it happened to be the day that the medical director had turned in his retirement. And Lisa said to my now boss, "Oh my gosh, Missy would be perfect. She's internal medicine and psychiatry." And I said, "Oh, not Heartview. It's not for me. I have no desire to work with addiction." So anyway, he said, "We don't need to see patients. It's 1 hour a week. Come in and sign off on policies and procedures." So in 2009, I started doing that. And I enjoyed it. I love the people here, and it's a great place. And I was there for about 1.5 years, and my director of nursing approached me and said, "Missy, we're having a problem with our opioid patients. They don't stay, they get sick, and by day 3 they leave, and we can't keep them. And it's bad out there." And I said, I'm not seeing patients. I'm not willing to do that. And she said, "Well, here's the science. Please read about this medication called buprenorphine, and just think about it." So I did read the science and it was compelling. And so in December of 2010, I started prescribing buprenorphine. The plan at the time was for it to be very short term, just keep people on it for a month, get them through treatment, get them off the medicine and get them on with their lives. But what happened was I started working with people and I started seeing how their lives were changed. And I saw that they were not impaired. And I saw that they were getting their kids back and opening checking accounts and getting off probation and going to school and doing all these really amazing things. And they convinced me that recovery looks different for everyone. And it was only about a year and a half later that I quit my job at the local hospital and I came over here and we've continued to grow. And now this is one of the best parts of my job. I'm blessed to live and work in a state where our first lady is a person of long-term recovery, and she has made it her platform to reduce the shame and stigma of addiction. And so I get to work with her and I get to speak all over the country on this topic because it is my passion, because I see it saving lives. And I think as Tom was talking about that stigma, my patients sometimes feel uncomfortable going to 12-step meetings. And I know how important those meetings are, and I want them there. And then when they go, I want them to be comfortable talking about their recovery. And so that's why I do this, because working with addicts has been the most incredible thing I've ever done in my whole career. I will never do anything else. To see someone get their life back and to see the fallout from that and how it affects their kids and their parents and their coworkers has just been the most phenomenal thing. And so that's kind of how I got here. And I like to tell that story, not to pat myself on the back, but I think that a lot of us fall somewhere on that spectrum. If you're not a super believer in Matt, you're probably somewhere on that road. And maybe you're even over here in that camp of, you know what, it's just one drug for another and you're keeping people sick and they shouldn't be coming to my meetings. And I hope that tonight we can have a good dialogue and cover the bases of abstinence and Matt and different things. And maybe we can come to some sort of a common ground. So that's kind of my story. I'm going to share my slides. This is what we're going to talk about. And again, the Heartview Foundation has been around since 1964. Currently, we are sitting at 44 residential beds in 2 different cities. By next summer, we will have 60 residential beds in 3 different cities. We continue to grow. It's been just a fabulous place to work. I also am the medical director for the North Dakota Professional Health Program. We work with physicians, PAs, med students who struggle with mental illness and substance use disorders. It's primarily an abstinence-based program. Though again, as the data is so compelling and we're starting to see more and more data, it is now becoming much more accepting of Matt. So this is just a basic little outline. We're going to talk about Addiction 101 and specifically focusing on opioids. Then I want to talk about recovery before we get into the conversations about Matt. So again, I assume there's not a lot of neurochemists in the room. I'm also not a neurochemist, but I think it is important to talk about the limbic system and the brain's reward circuitry when we talk about addiction, because when I work with people with substance use disorders, they describe it's like their brain gets hijacked. And this is the piece of their brain that gets hijacked. It's the limbic system, which controls our mood, memory, emotions, fear, anxiety, all of those things. It's responsible for how we perceive things, both positive and negative. And I like to put this slide up there because the first time my kids saw this slide, they were like, oh yeah, Mom, that's 9/11. And I said, yep. But when I see this image, I feel this image. I remember fear. I remember anger. I remember confusion. I remember all of the emotions that were tied into that day and the following days. And so what our limbic system does is it takes sights, sounds, and smells, it ties them with memories, and those memories come with emotions. So if you hear a song that you danced, it was the first dance at your wedding, and you hear that song, you immediately get taken back to that day, which hopefully was positive, right? Or you smell the food that your grandma made that was kind of her signature dish, and you smell that and you immediately think of your grandma. That is your limbic system that is tying those senses into memories and emotions. So it controls and regulates our ability to feel pleasure, which motivates us to repeat the behaviors that we need to survive. So healthy life-sustaining activities like eating, like drinking, like sex, will trigger a memory in our limbic system so that we do those things again, because we need to do those to survive. So as we get older and we get dementia, that part of our brain kind of goes away, and then we stop eating and we stop drinking because it's like our brain forgot that those things were important. So the key neurotransmitter in our limbic system that we're going to talk about is dopamine. It regulates movement, emotion, motivation, and for our conversation, feelings of pleasure. So drugs of abuse target our reward system by flooding the circuit with dopamine. And dopamine is our feel-good chemical. So we get this euphoria, right? When that reward circuit is activated, the brain triggers a memory, right? It's like we get dopamine, then we get a memory. That memory is a very positive memory. And then that teaches us that we need to do that behavior again, right? So how much dopamine are we talking about? Well, sitting here right now, in an average brain, it's about 50 nanograms per deciliter. And the numbers really aren't as important as just looking at how much it goes up, right? Sex takes that to 125, but look at heroin and methamphetamine. And I don't know if you guys are in the midst of a methamphetamine crisis, but we certainly are here in North Dakota. So heroin takes that from 50 nanograms per deciliter to 975 nanograms. So if I do heroin, my brain gets a dopamine bath. That dopamine lights up my pleasure centers, and it creates this really incredible positive memory. So as my brain gets used to having all of this dopamine around, it becomes overwhelming. So I stop making as much dopamine as I normally would. And I also cut back on the number of receptors that I have in my brain because it's too much dopamine, right? It's like, oh my gosh, this is too much. It's overstimulating. But then what happens is if you take that heroin away, you take that methamphetamine away, I don't go back to 50 because remember, I'm making less. So I might go back to 30 or 20 or 10 nanograms per deciliter. And if dopamine is our feel-good chemical, I don't feel good. And so what happens is my brain reminds me how good heroin felt, how good methamphetamine felt, how good alcohol felt, because again, it wants more dopamine. And that's sort of what leads to this vicious cycle of use. And then we go through withdrawal and use and withdrawal. So clinically, when we talk about drugs, the withdrawal from any substance is the opposite of the intoxicating effects. So opiates are downers, right? So everything slows down when we use opiates. So when we don't have them, then everything speeds up. Agitation, anxiety, runny nose, watery eyes, yawning, cramping, diarrhea, everything is amped up, right? That's the acute withdrawal that we get with opiates. This is the reason that patients weren't staying in our treatment center more than 3 days because they got dope sick and they got their running shoes on, right? But even after that very physical, horrible withdrawal, there's this subacute opioid withdrawal, which is primarily related to dopamine depletion. It's depression, lack of enjoyment, can't sleep, fatigue, not hungry, cravings, can't think. All of that is related to dopamine depletion. Now, my patients that have gone to prison tell me that it can take 9 to 12 months before that sort of resolves on its own. It's a very long process. Now, that's a lot of days to battle with this depression when your limbic system is continually reminding you how good heroin felt. Just use one time and then you can clean the house, or just use one time and you can go get a job, right? That's the game that is being played in our limbic system that was hijacked by drugs. So the severity of the withdrawal is lined up with the severity of the dependence. So if someone was really, really sick, their withdrawal is going to be really, really bad. And that contributes to that ongoing use. And I have patients all the time that say, Doc, I haven't been high in a long time. I'm just chasing away the sick. I just need to function. I haven't felt good in forever, right? So as we keep using, our body builds up a tolerance, right? So it's no longer a point of heroin that I need now, and now I need 3 points. Pretty soon I need a whole gram. And again, the more I use, the sicker I'm going to get. And so it's just this horrible, vicious cycle, and dopamine is a key player in that. So when we talk about, yep, this is what happens in our brain, but then what the heck happened in our country, right? Like, why are we in the throes of this opioid epidemic? Well, it kind of comes in three waves. The first one was prescription pills. So late 90s, we made pain a vital sign, right? Which means that every time you went to the doctor, they asked you about your pain. But at that same time, Purdue Pharmaceuticals was pitching OxyContin, and they sort of duped the medical system into believing that, you know, if you really had pain, you didn't get high, and if you really had pain, you couldn't abuse it. So you can see with that bright blue line, in the early 2000s, it really started to climb. But then what happened was in 2012, we had 259 million prescriptions for opioids in this country, 259 million bottles, which means every American adult could have their own bottle. So thankfully, we realized that was insane. So we started backing off and saying, okay, we're not going to prescribe as many opiates. We sort of started to see through the big pharma lies, and we cut back on prescribing. But what happened was it was supply and demand. So we cut off the supply, but the demand already existed. So people switched to heroin because the price of pills went up and heroin was cheap. So about that, you can see in that sort of royal blue color, it sort of peaks in that 11, 12, 13, 14. We really see a climb there, whereas prescriptions sort of leveled off. But now we're in this wave of synthetics, which is fentanyl, which is not dependent on the poppy plant. It is not dependent on someone growing it. It is exceedingly potent, so it's small amounts. It doesn't require a truck to bring it in. It's just a little package, right? One little sugar packet might have 100 doses or 1,000 doses, depending on who you're selling it to. So that purple line is the synthetic opiates, and you can see that is just skyrocketing. Round about 2014, we really saw a jump in that. So what is fentanyl? And again, you can see that those little pills in the corner, that is how fentanyl is being sold primarily now. So you can get pill binder on Amazon. You can get a pill press on Amazon. You can order fentanyl off the dark web and mix this up at home, right? This is what they're doing. Fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. It is synthetic, meaning it's made in a lab. In March 2015, the DEA issued a nationwide alert saying this is a threat to public health and safety. Since 2016, more overdose deaths were due to fentanyl and other synthetic opioids than any other type of opioid. And between 2013 and 2019, the overdose deaths involving synthetics increased more than 11-fold, right? So it has continued to skyrocket. And when I look at that trajectory, it is not sustainable for fentanyl. So this is just over a 3-month period. And you look back at like 2011, you know, we're probably talking 300 people every 3 months. And then we're up to almost 6,000 people every 3 months. So when we look at overdose deaths in all of those things, right? Prescriptions, heroin, fentanyl, you can see that from, you know, the numbers have continued to climb. And again, in 2020, 68,630 people died of an opioid overdose. But the story doesn't end there. It actually gets worse, right? Because COVID hit, right? COVID was horrible for recovery, right? Addiction is the disease of isolation, right? I think it was Jamal that was talking about the isolation piece. So addiction is a disease of isolation. And what did we have to do? We had to isolate. We had to stay in our homes. We could go to meetings via Zoom, but even that took a few weeks to get going. It wasn't like it was a smooth transition. And add to that the fear, the confusion, the questioning, the anger, all of those pieces. And what we saw was a complete spike in overdose deaths. 100,000 people died in 2021. Now that's not just opioids, that's all drugs combined, but 70 to 80% of those are opioids. So again, if we go back to 2020, it was 68,630. Here we're talking about probably 80,000 people in 1 year. Now, thank God we have Narcan all over the streets, right? I don't know what you have there, but I know here we flood the streets with as much Narcan as we can get. We hand it out to anyone that asks. People come in off the street asking for Narcan, we give them Narcan. If we didn't have Narcan, I can't imagine what this number would be, but my best guess is that it'd be 5 times higher than that. Because again, thankfully we have Narcan out on the streets. So, but it is not just opioids. And I know there's people in the room where opioids aren't your drug of choice, but If you look at this slide and pay specific attention to the bright blue line and the yellow line, those are stimulants like meth and cocaine. We don't just have an opioid epidemic, we have an addiction epidemic, right? We have to do a better job on the front end. We have to do more for prevention. Instead of arguing about what's the best treatment, we need to be talking to our kids in Head Start about drugs. My kids are now 11, 15, and 16. I have been talking to them since they were in preschool. We can have age-appropriate conversations with our kids, and we have to start doing that because we are wiping out our young people at a rate that is not sustainable. This synthetic overdose epidemic is alarming. So again, 70 to 80% of drug overdoses are related to opioids. 295 people die every single day from a drug overdose. So when I started giving these talks about 10 years ago, I used to say, during this talk, someone will die every 20 minutes. So in an hour, 3 people will die. Now it's 12. Now I have to say, during this hour, 12 people in this country are going to lose their life to a drug overdose. That is unacceptable to me, and we have to do something different. So we are 5% of the world's population. We claim 27% of the world's drug overdose deaths. We're not doing it right. We're not doing what we need to do to stop this epidemic. So NIH reported more than 80,000 people died of a drug overdose in 2021. More than 71,000 of those involved fentanyl. Compare that to the 20 years of the Vietnam War, where we lost 58,200 people. And there's a beautiful monument to those people in Washington, D.C. Or during the peak of the AIDS epidemic, we lost 43,000 people in 1 year. And 9/11, one day, we lost almost 3,000 people. We lose that many people about every 10 days, right? We've got to do something different because these numbers are, again, they're not sustainable. So I hope I have your attention, right? This is unfortunately the part of the talk where we all just sit back and go, oh my God, I didn't know it was that bad, right? It is that bad. So what is recovery? Well, it's a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential, right? It doesn't say they don't take meds. It doesn't say they go to meetings. It doesn't say that they exercise every day. It doesn't say that they eat healthy. It says that it's a process of change where you improve your health and wellness. You have a self-directed life and you strive to reach your full potential. So what that statement says to me, and again, that definition comes from SAMHSA. What that statement says to me is that everyone's recovery is different, right? It's a self-directed life, my life, not Mario's life, not Brandon's life, my life. So I get to decide what is my full potential, not someone else, not my husband, not my mom, right? So again, it's a process. And so everyone that's sitting in the room that is in recovery knows it's a process. You don't go to treatment and wake up and go, phew, this is recovery, this is amazing. No, it's a process, right? Every day we learn something new. So these are some of the different groups out there, support groups, to help people find that recovery, to find their self-directed life. There's Al-Anon, Pills Anonymous, Crystal Meth Anonymous, Smart Recovery, AA, NA, Women for Sobriety, Life Ring, ACOA, all of these different groups, Celebrate Recovery, they're all different. Why? Because we all need different things, right? There's a reason there's so many different churches, because not all of us want to be Catholic, right? So same with recovery. Not everyone goes to AA and finds what they need there. Some people have to go somewhere else to get what they need to find their recovery. So these are the 12 steps, right, on which many of those programs are based. And I'm not going to go through them because I'm guessing most of you know them better than I do. But it's again, this is a process, right? You don't get to go and go, ooh, 4 and 5 look terrible, so I'll just start with 6. Like we don't get to choose, right? You start at 1 and you process through them because that's what works, right? That's what works for people. But Celebrate Recovery, right? They're sort of based on the 12 steps, kind of, but instead they're more faith-based. The principles correspond to the Beatitudes. So again, based on the words of Jesus, that's where the Beatitudes come from. But you can kind of see how the steps play out in there as well. So Celebrate Recovery works for a lot of people. We have some very phenomenal Celebrate Recovery groups here in Bismarck. But again, that doesn't work for everyone either, right? Some people go, you know what? AA is too much faith. Celebrate Recovery is way too much faith for me. Maybe they want Smart Recovery, right? This is a 4-point program. Again, maintaining the motivation to change, coping with urges, managing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in an effective way, living a balanced, positive, and healthy life. Smart Recovery works for a lot of people. So why do we have so many different groups? Because we're all wired just a little bit differently, right? We all have different goals, different needs. And again, we could talk about yoga. We could talk about exercise. We have a Runners Against Destructive Decisions group here in Bismarck that was started by one of our judges. We run twice a week. People in recovery, people not in recovery. And it's just a phenomenal playing field where we're all level. We're all just runners. And there's something very powerful about that. And it, again, works for a lot of people. So what do we know about support groups? Well, Cochrane Review in 2020, they looked at active psychosocial interventions for alcohol use disorder, looking at AA and 12-step facilitated groups. And they said they often produce greater abstinence, notably continuous abstinence, reductions in drinking intensity, fewer alcohol-related consequences, and lower alcohol addiction severity. So what Cochrane does is they take a review of all the studies that they could find, and they looked at all of them, and this is what they said. Yeah, it works. Guess what? AA and 12-step facilitated groups work. 2007, a study said that people who go to more meetings were more likely to abstain than people who didn't go to meetings. So, but we all know that, right? That's why when you're first coming out, you want to do 90 and 90, 30 and 30, because we know that the more you go to meetings, the more you connect with people, the more accountability you have, the more likely you are to stay sober, right? And then study was done in 2008. It said people who had a greater substance use severity, more psychiatric symptoms, more prior arrests, and a stronger belief in AA-related philosophy had more improvements in substance-related problems. Again, if you buy into AA and you go to AA, you're more likely to stay sober. Well, that's not rocket science, right? I mean, if you're going somewhere and you buy in and you do the things, you get a sponsor, you work the steps, it's probably going to work for you, right? Because you're putting in the work, you're doing the work. It's that self-directed. What do I want out of life, and how do I get there? So again, we know that support groups work. But even the best of things can be misused or abused, right? So this lawsuit was in 2014. Basically, a family sued AA because their daughter was murdered by someone she met in AA. And they said, wow, AA has a responsibility because there's this thing called the 13th step. And they have an obligation to warn vulnerable women who are at these meetings that this is something that could happen, right? So the lawsuit was thrown out. Right? AA was not found to be responsible. But again, people can misuse anything, right? People can go to church and then they can use that faith to judge other people and put them down and to hate, right? People can go to AA or NA or Smart Recovery for the wrong reason. They can go there to hook up. They can go there to sell drugs. They can go there to find vulnerable people. Those things happen. It's not AA's fault. So I bring this up because one of the things I hear a lot about MAD is, well, there are people abusing it. That's not the medication's fault, right? And inherently, some of us want to push the limits of things, right? We want to take it a step farther. Maybe it's just because our life has been so chaotic that we have a hard time trusting the process, trusting the work. So I bring it up because does buprenorphine and methadone get abused? Yeah. Does AA get abused? Yeah. Should we shut down meetings? Absolutely not. Lives depend on those meetings, but lives depend on these medications too. So if recovery were a pie, no two pies would be alike, right? I don't care if you've had your sponsor for 10 years. Your sponsor's recovery looks different than your recovery, right? Some of us need more faith. Some of us need more work. Some of us need more family. Some of us need meds and trauma therapy and yoga and a bike and, right? All of those things. So if you put 100 people in a room who are in recovery, you should have 100 different recoveries. Some of them might be similar, but they're always just going to be a little bit different because we're all unique. We all have different needs. We all have different foundations. So again, if even my patients who have, you know, them and their spouse are in recovery, they don't have the same recovery. They can't. They're different people. So to talk about medication-assisted treatment, or MOUD, which is medications for opioid use disorder, we have methadone, buprenorphine, naltrexone, and naloxone, right? Those are the 4 medicines that we're going to talk about in brief. Again, I don't think you guys need to know the details of the medications, just sort of the process. So methadone, it's long-acting. It's synthetic, meaning it's made in a lab. It doesn't come from the poppy plant. It's dosed once a day. Higher doses are more effective at reducing opioid use. And then good outcomes are contingent on like the treatment, which isn't really that different than AA, right? People that go to meetings for a week and then stop going probably don't do that well. People that go to meetings for 5 years probably do a little bit better, right? So when we talk about medications for opioid use disorder, methadone actually binds in a similar way to fentanyl and oxy, but it binds really slowly and it binds really strong. So because it comes on really slow, you don't get the euphoria, you don't get that dopamine surge. And because it binds really tight, if someone's taking their methadone and then they were to relapse or return to use, they would not get the high. Only available through opioid treatment programs. So Wyoming is the only state that doesn't have opioid treatment programs. We were the 49th state. Clients are required by federal law to see a licensed addiction counselor or professional every single month. So if they're at an OTP for 10 years, they're going to see them 12 times a year minimum for 10 years. We are required to do drug screens, and you dose daily out of the OTP. So people that are on methadone come in every single day to get their methadone. I hear all the time from people that, oh, methadone's the easy way out. Well, at Heartview, we have an opioid treatment program, and we dose from 6 a.m. to 8:45 a.m. So 7 days a week, you need to come into our facility before 8:45 in the morning. There's nothing easy about that. And you have to meet these 8 federal rules in order to get meds to go home. Absence of drug use, you need to be coming in consistently, no behavior problems, no criminal problems, stable home environment. These are not easy if you are still actively using. You're going to be able to safely store your meds. You're going to have a stable home environment. Those things are very difficult to someone who is in active addiction. So I have people that have been dosing here every day for over a year. They don't get take homes. It's not easy. And I also hear that, you know, medication assisted treatment is a crutch. It's just a crutch. You know what? If I broke my leg, I'd use a crutch. Sometimes in life, we need a crutch, right? Sometimes we don't. But when we need one in order to function, I think crutches are really okay, right? Ask a physical therapist. They tell you it's all right. So this is some data from the Heartview Foundation. Again, we opened our opioid treatment program in February of 2017. So if you look at our data, at baseline, about a third of our patients had jobs. At 1 year follow-up, it was 70%. The monthly income went from 452 to about 863. People rated that said they had poor mental health. It was almost half at baseline. It was less than a quarter at 1 year. But most impressive, if you look at what percent injected drugs, it was 84% at baseline, 9% in the past month. Overdose, 61% had overdosed in their lifetime, but it was about 0.8% had overdosed in the last month. And we're talking about 300 patients. It's incredible what people can do if you give them the right tools. So if you're talking about 61% have overdosed versus 0.8, that's an incredible amount of lives that didn't end. So switching gears from methadone to buprenorphine. So Subutex is buprenorphine alone. Suboxone combines naloxone in there. And basically that's just to keep you from shooting it up, because if you inject it into your vein, you're going to get Narcan, because naloxone is Narcan. Sublocade is a once a month injection of buprenorphine, which is pretty incredible. We have actually been using a lot of Sublocade recently because it can't be misused, right? It goes into your skin, it forms a solid, and it sits there and it slowly absorbs over months. So we have been using Sublocade to help people get off of buprenorphine because it will self-taper over, like I said, 6 to 9 months. So if people do the injection for 6 months or so, and then it just slowly tapers and they don't get sick and they don't have that that depression and lack of interest in all of those things. So Sublocade has really been a game changer for us. Issues with it is it's super expensive, and insurance companies don't like to pay for it, of course. Buprenorphine has been around since 2002. It's a partial agonist. So it binds a little bit differently to the receptors so that, again, you don't get that dopamine surge, you don't get the euphoria. Usually it goes under the tongue, but it can, like I said, be injected into your abdomen or surgically implanted into your arm. We do not do that. I don't know anyone that does. It is very safe as well. Heavily regulated by the FDA. Any provider that wants to prescribe it has to notify the DEA that they want to do that. And then they show up and audit our charts. So it's kind of a cumbersome system, but well worth it for sure. So again, I can tell you all day that that people aren't getting high. But again, if dopamine is where the high is coming from, studies were done that show that buprenorphine and methadone both raise dopamine to normal levels, right? We're sitting here at 50. These two meds take it from 40 to 60, not 975, not 1100, not 500, not 200, to that normal range. People with low dopamine levels don't stay in treatment. Again, it's because they're depressed, they're fatigued, they don't want to eat, they can't sleep. So less than 10% of them will stay in treatment. Mortality rates for someone with an opioid use disorder who pursues abstinence-based recovery is 10 times higher than for people who receive meth. That's pretty incredible to me. So if I'm, a heart doctor and I'm not willing to utilize a medication that's going to lower someone's mortality, just based on principle, I don't think I could work, right? People wouldn't come see me if I wasn't willing to offer them a life-saving intervention. But this is a life-saving intervention. But no surprise, if you combine MAT with psychosocial treatment, it's superior to either one alone, right? So if people on buprenorphine and methadone can access AA, NA, SMART, Dharma, all of those things, they're going to do better. They need the support. If addiction is a disease of isolation, having that support lowers their risk of isolation. Opioid use disorder increases the risk of premature death tenfold compared to the general population. And 1 in 20 people who survive an opioid overdose will die within a year. 20% will die within the first month. So having an overdose actually increases your risk significantly of having another overdose. Those statistics are terrible. So anyone that overdoses, like if you have 20 people that overdose, one of them is going to be dead in the next year if they survive this one, right? CA Bridge is out in California. They've got great data on buprenorphine, and one of the stats they talk about is that MAT is associated with decreased overall mortality by at least 50%, and that's all comers. So in certain populations, it's more than that. So during the first 4 weeks of treatment, buprenorphine is associated with a 90% lower mortality rate. Methadone is 80% lower mortality rates. And both are associated with a 40% lower mortality rate after the first 4 weeks. So again, that initial, when you get them started, their lessening of mortality is significant in that first week, but it maintains. So even in someone who's started on buprenorphine and say they don't stay with treatment, they still have improved survival rates. And when you look at the mean duration of treatment, so someone on methadone, most of them stayed for 363 days. With buprenorphine, it was 173 days. Now think about when you go to meetings, if you see someone there for 363 days, by that point, a lot of them have a pretty good recovery foundation, right? So again, time matters in the disease of addiction. We know that the more time you have, the more likely you are to stay in the lane that you're in, right? The least amount of time is really where we worry the most about people. And specifically in our incarcerated population, we know that medication-assisted treatment saves lives. 15 to 25% of incarcerated individuals in the US meet criteria for having an opioid use disorder. So a quarter of them, basically. The courts recently found that denying MAT to people who are incarcerated likely violates the 8th Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment, and likely amounts to a disability discrimination under the ADA. So basically what they're saying is, if you're running a jail or a prison in this country, you need to offer this resource to people with an opioid use disorder. And again, one thing that I have really noticed in my time prescribing this medication is What it allows people to do is sit in a room and focus on what's important, because they're not having those intense cravings. They're not fiending for the drug. They can actually focus. They can actually pay attention to what's happening because their receptors are satisfied. They're not dopamine depleted. Their brains work like they need to work. The risk of unnatural death was 87% lower for incarcerated people on MAT compared to incarcerated people not on MAT. That's an incredible statistic. And in the month after release from incarceration, an individual is 56 to 129 times more likely to die of an overdose because we lose our tolerance, right? If I go into prison using a gram of heroin a day, and I'm there for 6 months and I come out and I use a gram of heroin, I will not likely survive that. And not everyone knows that. And not only do the drugs change in 6 months, but you lose your tolerance. So it is incredibly important in this population to offer this. And drug courts have lost some lawsuits because they were not offering MAT. So now they allow it as well. MAT reduces the risk of death from any cause by 85%, the risk of death from an overdose by 75% in the first 4 weeks following release. So just some take-home points. Addiction is a chronic relapsing disease of the brain. We used to say it was like the disease theory, the disease hypothesis. We know absolutely now that it is a disease of the brain. It involves the limbic system. It is about hijacking the dopamine system. Fentanyl is driving the overdose crisis. There are a multitude of options for mutual support groups, right? Because one size does not fit all. Recovery is an individual process that may or may not include MAT, right? It doesn't have to. I certainly have patients that don't utilize MAT, but it should be an option. MAT is more effective if combined with psychosocial supports, and it is definitely life-saving and vital to our incarcerated population while incarcerated, but also upon release. So big problems require a lot of tools, right? You don't go into this room here with a Clorox wipe, right? So we're not going to solve this addiction epidemic with one tool. We need as many tools as people can find, as they can dig up, whatever. We need everyone on board. We need lots of new ideas. The old ideas aren't working. We have to do something different. And it's never too late unless you're already dead. My boss is a person of long-term recovery. He's got about 35 years. And he always says, the only addicts we can't help is the one that's gone. You know, give us a chance. If they're alive, there's hope. If they're still breathing, we can still try to find a tool that will save them. But if it's too late, if you're Jerry's son, right, 4 years ago, it's too late. We don't need that story. That story's been done to too much. I don't want to hear those stories anymore. I want to hear stories of recovery and people living, people finding what they need. And how deep is the mud? It depends on who you ask, right? We all go through the same stuff differently. And again, everyone's story is unique, but we all have tools that we can share. And so we just need to be supportive. It's not one size fits all. I don't know the road to recovery for Jamal. I don't, right? He's gonna have to figure that out with lots of help from lots of people. And that's why sitting in the rooms is important. But for some people, they don't have the motivation to get in the rooms. And so we have to find a way to get them there. So that is my talk. I will stop my screen share so I can see the chat.
Yeah, let's go to that. There are some questions, but
okay.
But how about this doctor here, you guys? Oh my goodness. So thank you for again availing us of your expertise. And I do want to give a shout out to Dr. Lynn, who connected me with you. That is some very compelling evidence. But the thing too, Dr. Henke, is you're not coming out one side or the other. It's let's stop that. It's I'm here to help you decide what's best for you. Right. And then if it's abstinence, we're going abstinence. If it's MAT, we're going MAT. And, when I talk with your Jamal, correct? I mean, I don't know what was more impressive. Dr. Henke's command of the subject, or that she remembered everybody's name who shared a story. I mean, that was pretty awesome. So when you mentioned that you were in prison, and did anybody offer Matt to you on the way out or any of this? Okay, the answer was no. So, but like I told you guys, our chief prosecutor, Ellie Savitt, is going to start rolling a lot of this stuff out real soon. And that's good news. So, so with that, we've got a couple of lengthy questions. Dr. Henke, if you wanted to take one, then the next, and then we'll get
Sure. Yes,
into
and they all kind of, so the first one talks about buprenorphine being an opiate, right? So how is it distinguished from other opiates? So again, this is sort of my analogy. So if this is an opiate receptor, and we all have them, right? And I take fentanyl or OxyContin, it binds to that receptor, and I get the downstream release of dopamine, which lights up my pleasure centers. So methadone binds in much the same way, but it binds really slowly and it binds really tight. So I don't get that same euphoria. Buprenorphine it's called a partial agonist, which means that it kind of half sits on the receptor, so that again, you don't get the euphoria, but because something's sitting on your receptor, you don't have the cravings. So that is how they work a little differently. So the question was, the last month's speaker pointed out that street opiates and stimulants are coming from common legal sources.
Was that tall cop? Whoever
Yeah,
asked it?
yeah,
Yeah.
that the Imodium and dextromethorphan. So yes, I always tell people, we can abuse anything, right? We can abuse Benadryl, we can drink hand sanitizer, we can misuse anything. So do people misuse Imodium and dextromethorphan? Absolutely. Again, are there people that are misusing buprenorphine? Absolutely. Are there people that are misusing meetings? Absolutely. Right. This is not, but I don't really, it's all potentially equivalent. I'm just reading the question.
Well, Dr. Henke's reading that. We'll also take questions from everyone here with a mic. If anybody has a comment or a question, just raise your hand and Jermaine will come with the microphone, okay?
So one of the questions was about chronic pain patients utilizing buprenorphine. And so that buprenorphine did recently get an indication for pain management, again, because it works differently. It's a partial agonist. So there is less risk of abuse, addiction, side effects. So the question is talking about how we basically created this addiction epidemic by overprescribing pills. And now we're trying to educate patients that maybe you don't need to be taking pills all the time. And that is one of the things that I do in my clinic all the time. Like, listen, you did have pain. That doesn't mean you have to be a pain patient for the rest of your life. That doesn't mean you have to be a buprenorphine patient for the rest of your life. There are therapies that can be utilized. There are non-narcotic medications that can be used. Physical therapy is wonderful. Occupational therapy is wonderful. Yoga, massage therapy, lots of different modalities. I think the idea that we give someone a medication for their pain and that's going to resolve their pain issue is just not appropriate. So one of the things that I try to educate people on is that pain is protective, right? It's our body's way of saying something bad is happening, so stop doing what you're doing, right? Like if I have back pain and I'm just taking OxyContin and then I keep doing my concrete job, I'm probably going to further injure my back because I'm blocking that pain. So it's important that we pay attention to pain. Pain is actually important. So I think that that's one of the things we need to do is, again, really look at different modalities, a different way to look at it. We don't have to have people taking pain forever and ever and ever. If they will use some of the other modalities. And again, some people do have chronic pain, but that's where, therapy can be super helpful.
We have a question.
Yeah.
We'll get back to that list, but we have a question from one of the participants here. Go ahead, Adam.
Hey, Dr. Henke. My name is Dr. Adam Joy. I really appreciate your presentation. I absolutely see the benefit of MAT and helping keep people alive long enough to, or to find their journey in recovery. My question has to do with when people are MAT patients and then go to transition into abstinence. Some of what I've heard is that the relapse rates can be pretty significant when people try to make that transition. I'm just wondering what data you've seen, or if you've been able to figure out a way to better help people transition for those who choose to come off of MAT and choose abstinence and go that
That's
route.
a great question.
That is a great question. And actually, that was mentioned in the question and answer as well. So again, prior to Sublocade, it was very difficult to taper people off of buprenorphine that wanted to come off, right? Because they would, if you stop cold turkey, you again can have some withdrawal because those receptors want something sitting on there. But if you slowly take away the medication, then you don't get as sick. But buprenorphine is a difficult medication to taper off of. So utilizing Sublocade has been a game changer. And I've had, we were a pretty small clinic, but I've tapered 6 people off in the last year utilizing Sublocade, and they're doing great. Now, prior to that, in 10 years, I'd probably tapered off 5, and it was a process that took at least 12 months. Because once you get sick, your brain reminds you of what you could be doing. So it was difficult. Now with methadone, because it's a liquid, you can drop by 1 milligram at a time. So if somebody is on 60 milligrams and they want to come off, lowering by 1 milligram a week, or 1 milligram every other week, it seems like a long taper, but it really isn't when you consider maybe they've been using for decades. If you go really slow with a methadone taper, we've been able to get a few people off that way. And again, we've only been in an opioid treatment program for about 5 years, but we've been able to get, a half a dozen people off the right way. And again, I always tell people, if your recovery is a pie and 90% of your pie is Suboxone, you should probably stay on Suboxone or buprenorphine. But if you have 100 pieces of your pie and it's church and yoga and your sponsor and all of these wonderful things, and one piece of your pie is buprenorphine, it's not going to be hard to get off the buprenorphine because you have so many other pieces to your pie. So when someone is wanting to come off of MAT, and I'd have this conversation almost every day in my office, when someone says, I don't like taking something that reminds me of my old life. How can I come off of this? And then we strategize and we have a plan. I always say, but you're going to have to ramp it up in other areas. Like you're going to have to do the things, you're going to have to figure out a way to cope with any withdrawal that you might feel, because if you don't, then you're going to struggle.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, that is really good. I'm sorry.
And I think that's true for people not on MAT. I mean, if your recovery is meetings and a sponsor and that's all you've got, you're going to need more tools. And so I do work with people. I also have people that have been on buprenorphine for 10 years and they have no desire to come off. They're like, my life is perfect exactly as it is. This medication doesn't bother me. I feel stable on it. I'm not changing a thing because I remember how chaotic life was, and I'm never going back to that. So I tell people, it's your recovery, it's your road. As long as you're following my rules, I don't have a problem with you staying on the medication. There's no long-term effects from buprenorphine. So people can stay on it as long as they need to.
While you're queuing up another question, just briefly for everybody here and our participants online, please remember to fill out our survey because this is why we've got this marvelous guest speaker here. You all asked for this subject to be covered again. FAN offers peer recovery coaching, both family and peer, okay? We have an amazing stigma workbook. Dr. Henke, I think I sent that to you.
You did, and it is phenomenal.
Okay, good. So there's a recommendation right there. So you can go online and get it. It's for free. I think we're up to like 20,000 copies now. And we are creating content around that workbook, Dr. Henke, focused on teenagers and young adults. So that won't be ready until next year, but we're working on that. So are there any more questions from anyone here? Okay, then we're gonna, go ahead, Jermaine.
My name is Jermaine Atkins, and I am the Washtenaw County Families Against Narcotics Board Vice President, as well as a person in long-term recovery. And what that means for me is that I haven't had a drink or a drug since December 2nd of 2015. So I recognize my day of being officially drug and alcohol free is December 3rd, 2015. But my question is, and in regard to MAT, there is a lot of stigma associated with it. However, after hearing the data, which this isn't the first time I've heard the data, as far as how beneficial it can be, there are still a lot of organizations such as sober living homes, other outpatient programs that don't necessarily work with people who are utilizing MAT or MOUD, as you've described it earlier. And I think the general attitude is that that organization or company simply doesn't support that method, right? However, as a person who has a sober living company, I'm just, I guess I just wanted to just be known that that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't support that method. I know that my company, we just have a very difficult time monitoring if someone is diverting the tablets or the strips, which was solved by the Sublocade shot. But then since that happened, which I thought was great, we've had a difficult time monitoring if someone was using Sublocade as a means to stay off of fentanyl or heroin, but they were also taking additional Suboxone to feel the euphoric effects. And we weren't able to monitor those levels in a cost-effective way. So we just simply couldn't do it, right? However, my question is that are there, like, first of all, am I correct in thinking that a person could use Sublocade to minimize their cravings, but also take additional buprenorphine products to experience the euphoric effects? Is that even true for me to even think that's like the case? And secondly, are there any products or medications that can be used that can't be utilized for euphoric benefits? I know that was a long question.
No,
so
that's
sorry.
okay.
No, let me say that I didn't know that level of detail. That's unbelievable. The monitoring that you have to do, Jermaine, in order to just keep your umbrella in order.
Yeah, and most testing that involves checking levels of buprenorphine or any medication in someone's system is generally very expensive.
Yeah.
And if a housing company were to utilize lab tests, which that is what they would have to use, the price of sober living will go up astronomically. So I'll let you answer the question. So
Yeah,
sorry about
and I would tell you, we do test for levels of buprenorphine. I don't always find it to be helpful, because if somebody just took it an hour ago and the level is really high, and the next time I take it an hour, that I get the UA an hour before they took it, the level is really low. What I find to be more helpful, Jermaine, is just looking at someone clinically, right? UAs are wonderful. They're super helpful, but a lot of times you can look at someone and know if they're doing well or not, right? If they're in your sober living and they're getting up every day and they're going to work and they're paying their bills and they're going to meetings, how helpful is a UA? It really isn't. But if someone is laying around, they had 3 jobs in the last 2 weeks, they broke their phone, and and they're doing all this chaos and craziness, you probably don't need a UA, because you probably know that they're not actually doing what they say that they're doing. So, and we have the same issue with sober living homes not allowing medications. So here's what I know about buprenorphine. I have had patients that have said to me, I tried to get high, doc. I took 8 of them. I was hoping I would get high. I didn't get high, because again, it's a partial agonist. So if you take a lot of it, you don't necessarily feel any more from it. Now, methadone is different. If you take a bunch of methadone, you will eventually feel something. So if someone got the Sublocade shot and they're trying to use buprenorphine like tablets or strips on top of it, I'm not sure what they would be getting out of that. Now, as someone who doesn't take an opiate, if I took a buprenorphine, I might feel impaired because I'm not used to that in my system. But it's different for people who are dependent on opiates. And again, I've had people that they've even tried shooting it up. They've tried taking a whole bunch and they generally don't get the euphoria. So, but here's what I do. So we did buprenorphine for about 6 years before we started doing methadone. So buprenorphine has like kind of a ceiling effect where if someone has a really tremendous tolerance and you max out their dose of buprenorphine, they may still have breakthrough cravings. Like there's a certain subset where methadone works better. And the data is pretty clear that like if you're an IV heroin user or an IV fentanyl user, methadone might be better. So in someone that's saying, yeah, I got my Sublocade shot, but I still need more, it might be just that they have such an incredible tolerance to that, that they're trying to chase away the withdrawal. I mean, those would be my best guesses on that one. And again, to be a sober living home, it is a lot of monitoring, but I tell you what, it is so hard for me to see people that have to choose between their medications or a house, right. You know, because they're in treatment, they're doing great. And they're like, but I don't have anywhere to live unless I come off this medication. But I also, on the other side of it, I get it. Like it's hard to police people. So
we get that often in our community.
Thank you very much, Doctor. But I hope I'm not taking up all of the question time. But I was just listening to a couple of people that I know who are in the recovery community, and they were all just kind of just saying like, oh, you can definitely feel the euphoric effect from taking multiple Suboxone strips and things along those lines. But on like back to like your remark about the clinical observation, and that's pretty much what we have been doing is when we try this, allowing people into the home who are using MAT, and the observation was exactly what we had to base things on. Like we would get a phone call to say like, hey, you know, I have one of my housemates over here and they're like nodding off on the couch. You know what I mean? So we would know just from observing that there's something off, and we would assume that it was the overtake, that they were overdoing their prescription medication or perhaps getting additional strips from someone else. And just like you said, it was a very challenging situation to have to ask someone to leave based on our observations when the result of losing the housing could be so detrimental. Yeah. So it really left us, and I'm sure it puts other operators in a position of just being afraid to have to make that call. So thank you very much for sharing your opinion though.
Well, thank you for what you're doing.
I hope it helped.
There's a question here. Another terminology question, washing up families against narcotics. Is there a conflict with this title and the use of narcotics in MAT? I will tell you that when I first came across Families Against Narcotics, that name, I found myself letting people know that this organization helps anyone, not just people battling an addiction to a narcotic. If alcohol is involved, if marijuana is involved, I think I just told you guys about helping a couple with their daughter. She was anorexic, gambling, sex addiction. We don't care, okay? So I did try to go back to Fan and say, maybe we should redo the name, but there's so much branding right now around that name, 16 years worth, Dr. Henke. And so the decision was, I went, same thing that David Gordon said. I was like, I don't know if this name works because we're much broader than that name implies, but it was like, we're just going to roll with Fan. You know, So that's the acronym. So that's the answer to that question.
And then there, do you
go ahead.
care, Mario? There's a couple of questions about naltrexone. So I just
Yeah,
wanted to.
yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So again, back to our opioid receptor, right? Naltrexone, I think of naltrexone as like long-acting Narcan. So it kind of puts a ceiling on that receptor so that if you use, you don't get to feel it. You don't get the euphoria. The only issue that I have with naltrexone is you have to be completely through your withdrawal before naltrexone can be used. Because if you use it before then, you will put someone into withdrawal. So if someone is coming out of a long-term hospitalization or a long-term incarceration, naltrexone would be an option. It can either be taken once a day as a tablet, or it can be an intramuscular shot once a month, which again is exceedingly expensive. But so we do use naltrexone. We use a lot of naltrexone at Heartview for alcoholics. It is really hard with opioid patients to get them through the withdrawal. And again, they might get through the physical stuff, but they still have that subacute withdrawal, that dopamine depletion, and naltrexone doesn't do anything for dopamine. So in those situations, we are much more likely to use either buprenorphine or methadone. So that's kind of my spiel on naltrexone. One of the questions was, does MAT reduce the incentive for eventual abstinence? I don't think so. I think that as people are in recovery, we're always talking about goals, right? And our goals change throughout our life. So sometimes people tell me like, oh, I'm going to be on this medicine forever. It's like, I feel normal and life is great. And they might get down the road and go, you know, my kids are getting to be teenagers and I don't know that I want to do this anymore. So we shift our goals and we have those conversations. And again, I don't think that abstinence is better than MAT or MAT is better than abstinence. It depends on the individual and what their goals are, and again, what their self-directed life looks like. So I think the goal for anyone is just to live that self-directed life, whatever that looks like. And so whether it's abstinence or whether it's MAT, doesn't matter to me. What matters is that they're happy. So I don't think it would reduce the incentive.
Did
Yeah.
we cover, is there anybody here who has any further questions? We got, okay. I think Dr. Henke, did we cover
The
everything?
only thing we didn't talk about was harm reduction. And so harm reduction is a spectrum, and it's really, again, I don't think the term medication assisted treatment replaces harm reduction. I think harm reduction is just a different way to look at things. And so harm reduction can include medication assisted treatment. It can include clean needle sites, safe injection sites, medical grade heroin. There's all kinds of different things that fall in that harm reduction. I think that given the addiction epidemic that we're in right now, the focus is in reducing harm, because the harm is that people are dying. And so I don't think of harm reduction as a dirty word. I think, isn't that why we went into medicine, right? Isn't that why I became a doctor, so that I could reduce people's harm? It's because I want diabetics to control their sugar so they keep their feet. And I want, people with heart disease to control their cholesterol so they don't have another heart attack. So I think that that's really what a lot of us do is harm reduction. And so I think medication assisted treatment is part of recovery. I think harm reduction is a different modality altogether, but I'm a believer in harm reduction, because if it keeps people alive, then it keeps them alive another day, and then maybe they make it into my office, and then we can have a real conversation, or they make it into your meeting, and then we can have a real conversation. So anything that keeps people alive, I'm all for it. Again, I've got 2 teenage daughters at home and a tweener of a son, and I'm thinking, I hope to heavens they never need any of this, but if they do, I want them to have the buffet of options that will keep them alive.
Yeah. Well, and I will tell all of you that, and you, Dr. Henke, and we'll close this up. I'll say a few things, but my son was denied the options that you just articulated, and he left on his own accord from a facility with the worst withdrawals from heroin that the nurse had ever seen. And she called to tell me that, to reach out to him, because he was in trouble, and he was found dead a few days later. because he didn't have a doctor like you. So thank you very much for being with us today, Dr. Henke. I am so thankful to Dr. Lynn Hankes for recommending you. You will see me, well, you won't see me, but what's the gig in North Dakota? Recovery
Reinvented. So it's
Okay.
one day a year where we just get to celebrate all things recovery in the state of North Dakota. Our governor and first lady bring in speakers from all over the country. We get to hear stories from people who live here and work here, and it is the most feel-good, phenomenal day. And since
And-
COVID, virtual is an option. And
Yep.
if you've
Yeah.
never been, go. You will it will fill your cup.
Yeah. So you can participate virtually. I'm not flying to North Dakota. I'm going to be participating
Not
virtually.
in November.
No, not in November. So, and in fact, there's a trauma expert who is speaking. That really piqued my interest and curiosity. I'm going to participate all day long, but that in particular piqued my curiosity. So we are past due, but I wanted you all to know our next meeting is more than likely going to be in a different new venue. In fact, the place is called The Venue. It just opened up in Ann Arbor near Stimson and South Industrial. We're not leaving the Freight House. It's just, we're going to see how it goes over there, and just for a change of pace, we certainly won't have trains going by at the venue, but we'll be back here in December. But that meeting is on race and addiction, and what the data tell us about the disparate way that this crisis that Dr. Henke just articulated is disproportionately affecting people of color. We've got an amazing guy, Dr. Don Vereen from the University of Michigan School of Public Health, who is going to moderate a panel discussion. Jermaine, who is standing right here, is on that panel. Crystal Reyes is on that panel. We have someone, Arabic person is on the panel as well. And I'm reaching out, Dr. Henke, to the person that you recommended, Native American. I hope to connect with her at some point in the next day or two. My point is, they're going to share their stories. We're going to have an epidemiologist who's going to talk about the data. And that next meeting is not meant to answer the questions or address the problems. We're just going to talk, and we're going to have ongoing discussions on that topic. So it'll be one of 2 or 3 successive meetings where, as a community, we're going to get together and talk about it. So with that, we're going to let you get back to the 2 teenagers and the tweener. Okay. And yeah. And is that your home office or work office?
This is my work office. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, get home.
I can't do this at home. I have 2 golden retrievers. So
Okay.
there would be all kinds of nonsense happening.
Yeah. Well, you're awesome. And
Thanks for having me.
I can't thank you enough. You take care.
You as well. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Guys.